going to talk about purchasing. In these sessions, we're looking at segregation of duties and sensitive access rules. These again might be softball, rules if you're familiar with this line of work, but nonetheless, it's important to talk through the issues. And in this session, we're going to look at purchasing. All right, Jess, so let's start off with the first one. The ability to create purchase orders and define procurement approval routing rules. To me, that's a combination of the transaction, to create the purchase orders, and configuration of the transaction itself, which a lot of people don't really get into. Is when we think of SOD, we think of transactional SOD, but you've argued a long time that people also need to be thinking about transaction as well as configuration of the transactions, right? So perhaps this is a good example to start us off on that discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime you have an application control, whether it's an approval workflow or like the ability to enter supply or enter POs is driven by some type of configuration like buyers or procurement agents. Anytime you have a transaction that is dependent upon some sort of configuration, whether it's a security configuration or a workflow configuration, so it's a workflow design or a BPM process in ERP cloud terms, then those should be separated. So the transaction should be something that an end user has. The configuration is something that an IT user has as it relates to people that are authorized to make changes that go through the change control process. So this is a pretty significant gap in many organizations. They don't think of it in terms of transactions and configurations, and they don't work hard to design roles and processes to separate those. But inherently, if somebody has the ability to do both, they have the ability to change a purchase, a PO approval limit, for example, or modify the workflow process somehow, and they also have the ability to enter a PO. Yeah. That gives them the ability to override a control design. So whether it's temporarily or permanently, they can change the configuration, and then they can transact against that configuration. So those transaction versus configuration type of SOD rules are very important from both an operational perspective as well as from a compliance perspective.
Yeah. Okay. I suppose the next one in the last area we talked about was around payables, and then we got into suppliers as well. The next rule I wanted to cover was the ability to create suppliers and create purchase orders. And perhaps I should preempt that by saying, in systems where suppliers need to be approved, we're encapsulating that in the creation process. So you can create a supplier, but you've got to approve them. But in this context, when I'm talking about creating a supplier, that's the ability to approve a supplier so they're active, and create purchase orders. So why should we be worried about that apart from the obvious?
Well, interestingly, this is another area that it's easy to get wrong, I guess, in terms of solution design or SOD design. So, for example, if the supplier, if the workflow process of designing a supplier is adequate, if you will, so that's whoever's entering that supplier cannot approve the supplier, and there's no way to bypass the approval process, then that's a pretty strong, what we would consider a strong mitigating control. In and of itself, then a buyer having the ability to initiate a supplier, onboard a supplier, as long as it's being authorized and reviewed by somebody independent, then that SOD conflict between enter suppliers and enter purchase orders isn't really a valid concern, because both the PO approval process is often approved independent of the person entering, and the supplier process is approved by independent of the person that's entering. So that's based upon your assumption, that's it could be argued that wouldn't be an SOD conflict that has to be evaluated because of the strengths of the mitigating controls, i.e. the design of the workflow approval processes, both for suppliers and POs. If you flip the argument around, if both of those approval processes weren't in place, then there would be a strong argument to segregate suppliers versus purchase orders.
Yeah. Okay. Now, we've touched upon separation of duties. What about, putting aside the combination of things in terms of single risk or sensitive access? What's a particular area around purchase orders that you always advise customers to be wary of?
Well, we've done work a lot in the Oracle application space. So I'll give you an example from an EBS perspective, eBusiness Suite, which is obviously their on-prem solution, and then talk about how that differs perhaps from their cloud solution. So in the on-prem world, so eBusiness Suite, I'm going to step back and just say I always have to understand how a supplier comes to be onboarded. So are there already fictitious suppliers potentially in the supplier master database, or is the process that's being used to onboard a supplier something that a buyer can influence to the point where they either there's no approval process, like there's no workflow process, or even the process outside the system, it may not have the right controls such that they can effectively create a supplier that is fraudulent or fictitious. Yeah. So most organizations, I go in with the assumption that even in an organization, frankly, that has supplier approval workflow process, if they've converted a bunch of suppliers from legacy system, I always have to assume that there are, at one point, the controls weren't good, and there are fictitious suppliers within the database. Yeah. So if I'm looking at purely from a fraud perspective, I'm assuming that either they can create a fictitious supplier or fraudulent supplier, or there's already one in the existing database. And in and of itself, when I look at purchase order, the process, the question is, can a buyer initiate a PO without it going through the approval process? And the common design we see within eBusiness Suite is the buyer does have an authority to initiate a PO and approve it within their limit. So the fraud risk is just based upon the limit they have. So the PO approval limits that they're set up for, we would advise management that your fraud risk is up to whatever level the buyer has. And then of course, if a buyer enters a PO, if it's above their limit, they're going to go through an approval process to their manager. So that's the way I would look at it from a EBS perspective, because there's not an easy way to differentiate. The operational issue really is there's not an easy way to differentiate a PO that's being converted from an approved requisition versus a PO that's being entered manually. So the fact that they have to enter it manually means, or convert from a requisition means they have to have the same limit to be able to enter them manually.
Yeah.
So looks much different on a system where the approval process is fully automated and they don't have that same system or same abilities like in other systems.
Okay.